today. I'm Kendall Langston. On behalf of the Pivot and Pace team, I'd just like to welcome you along. We've got an interesting discussion to open with Roger. So I'll get into it. I guess, I was sort of saying to Roger before, the reason I sort of wanted to do this was really for selfish reasons. As we're out and about talking to so many boards and senior teams and CEOs, there's a lot of concern about what's happening over that next horizon, or some of the geopolitical, the big questions that we see in the world today. What's going on in Europe, what's happening with the US, China, global warming, some of these big trends. And so that led to engaging Roger, who's, we've had him speak before at some of our at a CEO event here, but it was really an opportunity to do it in this forum, which allows people to join from a wide range of geographic locations. So, going from sort of selfish reasons to get the heads up on what the big patterns are, we're lucky enough to have Roger here today, and I've asked him to give us some insights into some of the big economic and geopolitical issues that we're facing, and perhaps some of the emerging patterns that we're going to see in that space. Roger advises boards and CEOs and leadership teams on the strategic implications of a fast-changing world. Successful engagements he's had have been delivered in diverse sectors, including the financial sectors, agribusiness, energy, telecommunications, healthcare, and infrastructure. And he's a senior fellow of the Atlantic Council in Washington, a member of the Digital Council of New Zealand, and an Edmund Hillary Fellow. So in addition, Roger's helped establish the world's largest foresight program called the Future Agenda. And he's also partnered with an ex-advisor to the UK Prime Minister to deliver a number of public sector innovation courses in Australasia for the Australian New Zealand School of Government. So he has an extensive bio, which I won't read out totally, but Roger, we're lucky enough to have him reside in Christchurch here. We get to hang out with him a bit and see him around the business sector. And so I'm really excited to introduce Roger today.
So thank you for that, Kendall. I'm just going to share my screen to kick things off, and then we'll get right into it. So before I sort of go into where the world is going to go, I want to take you through some insights I've learned over the years around how these things sort of generally progress. And what you see is that the first thing people should be thinking about when you're looking at large-scale changes is to try and get out of the trap of focusing on technology. So you should be looking across a whole range of different areas, including environmental issues, societal issues, politics, a whole range of issues. And I'll talk you through some of these as we go. Next, you need to start filtering it down. So what do some of these issues mean for the sector or the industry that you work in? And then you get to the most important bit in the filtering process is, what are the right questions we should be asking in order to have the right strategic response? So often what I see is organizations starting at this point on the right without going further up the chain. And it used to be a lot more challenging for me to talk about this until we had the pandemic, and then we have the Ukraine and things like this. Now people are starting to get really interested in what's going on in the world and how you start to get the right questions being formed. And a lot of that is down to an increase in this thing called VUCA. Now, a few years ago, when I talked to leadership teams about this, people would say, well, what the hell is VUCA? Well, it stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And that term is now cropping up a lot in leadership teams and at board level, because people are understanding that the stability that we've known for a number of years has evaporated very slowly but steadily over the last couple of decades. Now, for evidence of how that's changed, you just need to look around at popular media. So this is a screenshot from July 2020 from the BBC front page. And on that, you can see a whole range of issues, any one of which would have justified an entire front page, a decade ago. So we have the pandemic, we have challenges to democracy, we have space missions, we have worldwide recession, we have cyber attacks, all sitting there on one page. And what you find is that people get really challenged in how they try and separate a signal from noise. So what are the things you should be paying attention to, and what are the things you can safely discount? And to help you do that, you need to be thinking about how to process information, and that comes down to mental models. Now, one of the first things you need to think about is the difference between what is complex and what is complicated. And people often get those two things confused, but they're really important. So the best way to think about this is on the left-hand side, for example, we have an antique Swiss watch. Now, if that antique Swiss watch stopped functioning, you could take that to a repairer who specialised in that, had decades of experience, had all the right tools, the right network, the right suppliers, could pull that thing apart, lay out all the pieces on their workbench, and then reassemble it perfectly. That's complicated. On the other side, we have complex. Now, complexity can be best thought of in terms of an analogy. So if you looked out the window and you saw the perfect cloud, and you said, somehow, I love that cloud so much, I want to replicate it and copy it and just keep making copies because it's beautiful. And then you thought, well, maybe I can put it in a glass box and I can encase it in this box and I can measure every single variable inside that box. Altitude, temperature, light, humidity, the whole lot. And then somehow, because I know all those variables, I can create a replica of that cloud. But it doesn't work. Cloud formation is controlled by a whole range of complex systems working in ways that are inherently unpredictable and not replicable. So that means that basically you can't copy a cloud. And people often get confused between what's complex and what's complicated and where you need to apply the right level of thinking. And I'll come back to this a bit later on, but it's really important to remember that because complex systems are in their nature inherently unpredictable. Right now, we have a number of complex systems in play in a way that haven't been operating for quite a few years. Now, the other thing to think around when processing information is that in some situations with some organizations, people tend to think that there's sort of like this Newtonian sort of decision process where classic decision theory says if you put the right information in front of the right people at the right time, they'll do the right thing. But the problem is that actually doesn't always work. And so what you find is that people miss things, people can't pick up on certain bits of information, and they get stuck in this idea, they're locked in these paradigms where you can't see what's happening. So what you find, for example, as an example of this would be the Davos World Economic Forum every year produces this global risk report. And I'll give you an example of what was missing in that shortly. And you'll see exactly what I mean by putting the right information in front of the right people at the right time. But typically, the next question I get asked when doing this sort of work is why bother, right? So why would you even think long term? Where are the benefits from this? And there's an organisation you may have heard of called McKinsey, and they did this really interesting piece of work in 2017 called the Corporate Horizon Index. And what they did was analyse data around corporate performance. And it's actually one of the very few studies where someone's actually taken time to look through previous work and indicators and crunch the data and give you a fairly definitive response as to why you should think about the long term. Now, because it's McKinsey, it wasn't 50% or 45%, it was 47%. McKinsey charged you for that extra percentage accuracy, but you can sort of get the idea around the value of thinking about long term from this research that they did. And it's really important because coming back to their idea around mental models and decision-making theories, what you find is that people get stuck in particular ways of thinking. This is my favorite cartoon from The New Yorker. And people can get stuck in paradigms, and they can shift in all sorts of ways while you're out. And you can be out for all sorts of reasons. The other way of thinking about this is that no one knows who's skinny dip until the tide goes out. But when the tide goes out, like it is now, you start to see where all the things are left exposed and what that might mean. Now, examples of this can be found in recent corporate history. So this is one of my favourite magazine covers from 2007, actually, from Forbes. What's interesting about this cover is you have a picture of someone who has over 1 billion customers, and you think, how could they lose, right? They've got 1 billion customers. How are they going to actually, lose that market? How are they going to lose market share? Well, it's interesting if you think about friends and colleagues. Who owns a Nokia phone now? And that guy isn't smiling anymore. That was only 2007. And they got locked in this paradigm that because they had so many customers, that they could just keep on winning and winning and winning. I have friends who worked in the ethnography and forward innovation teams for Nokia in Helsinki, and they started leaving as soon as the iPhone came out. Literally, weeks after the iPhone came out, they resigned. And I got hold of them and said, so, why are you leaving? What's going on? You've got this great role. And they said, Nokia's lost. Management team can't see it. They're stuck in this paradigm. They don't understand the value is no longer in the handset, it's in the ecosystem around it. So they left. But the management team, the leadership team was stuck in this paradigm that actually they had so many customers they couldn't lose. So it's an interesting corporate example. A more recent example, I mentioned earlier around the World Economic Forum, what they do with this global risk report. So they produced this risk report. This was the one of the summaries from January 2020, where they actually look at the likelihood of long-term risks materializing in the next decade. So if you just take a minute to scan those risks from left to right, you can probably see there's one important risk missing. So bear in mind, this is January 2020. So when this report came out, there was something happening in Wuhan, but yet the pandemic is not on that list. So what's interesting is that this global risk report also highlighted wildfires, because at the time, wildfires were raging through Australia. And so that went up. So what you find is that people typically project the future based on current experience and current examples, and find it very difficult to get out of these paradigms that lock them in. So one of the ways that I help clients think about this is models, and the model that I use sometimes I call STEEP tectonics. So STEEP is society, technology, economics, environment, and politics. And tectonics, well, I'm from New Zealand, from Christchurch. We've had earthquakes here. A lot of New Zealanders on the call understand how tectonic plates move, and when they move, they create friction. So the analogy here is that there are 3 major layers of volatility right now. So the first top layer are changes that typically have happened over decades right across a number of different areas. So it could be recessions, it could be environmental changes, politics, change of governments, that sort of thing. What you have at the bottom is increasing environmental degradation. So what we're going to see is the frequency and scale of these environmental shocks is going to increase, and it will increase, you're seeing it right now, for example, where just last week the US Forestry Service came out and said, we don't think there's a fire season anymore. We just think it's just fires all year round. What is in the middle of all this now is the pandemic. And it's interesting that people have always asked me, well, where do you think the pandemic is now? I think it's possibly in the middle, maybe a bit to the left. The pandemic has quite a sting left in its tail potentially, and I'll talk about that later on. But what happens is when these 3 layers collide, because they are many complex systems interacting, things pop out that you don't really expect. So in 2015, I led a small team. We spent 4 months analysing the impact of a global pandemic. And one of the things we very quickly recognised that it wasn't the immediate health issues which would be the problem, but supply chains. So 2nd and 3rd order impacts. And so what's been fascinating to me watching the evolution of the impacts of the pandemic is a few months into the pandemic, people started going, oh, this is going to affect supply chains, because they were really focused on the first level of impact and not looking so much at the second and third layers. So steep tectonics is a really interesting model to keep in your head, to start thinking around when something happens, where does it sit, what's it going to interact with, and what are some of the unpredictable things that might pop out the other end. I'm going to talk about the top layer now, and in my business, we have these things called drivers of change, and right now there are many cascading drivers. I could talk about those all day, but I'm going to pick out 4 key ones. So these drivers all affect each other and they cascade down the line. So the first one is technology. So this could be a server room from any of the very large organizations or anyone using AI. And this is sort of one of the range of technologies that I'm watching. But there are 6 key technologies that are moving very fast right now. Biology, robotics, artificial intelligence, information, nanotech, and energy. And each of these technologies is getting cheaper to operate and faster in how it accelerates, which means that you can take one of these technologies from one area, combine it with something else, and drop it into another one, and things pop out. So the model I use for that is it's like a pile of kids' building blocks like Lego, where each of these technologies is a different color, and you can pick one off one stack, combine it with another one, and then you get really interesting things dropping out. So one of the interesting things dropping out, which I don't think people are paying enough attention to, is in biology. So we have a look at that, and what you're seeing is the cost of gene sequencing is dropping through the floor. So in 2007, it took 10 months to sequence the human genome, cost about $1 billion. It was an extraordinary technological breakthrough. In 2015, the time to sequence the genome dropped down to 27 hours. Now it's dropped down below $1,000. Bear in mind it was almost $1 billion when they managed to first make it happen. And then you can also do it using a laptop rather than a specialized laboratory. So that's interesting. And then you look at, so what would that mean? So in the States, what you're finding is that increasing numbers of people are getting their genetics tested. So it's also going up exponentially. So that means you have this massive database of genetic information that's also coinciding with a massive fall in the cost of using that information, using technologies like CRISPR, which enables you to do gene editing. So the actual cost and speed of gene sequencing has fallen faster than Moore's law. If you're familiar with Moore's law, what it is the scaling law which dictates the speed and cost of computing. You know how fast that has fallen over the years, and the cost of gene sequencing has fallen faster than Moore's law, which says that something fundamentally different is happening in the biological world. So first cascading driver is technology. There are 6 different technologies within that. We haven't got time to go into those right now, but what you find is that when fast-moving technologies such as robotics and AI start to get steam, it starts to impact jobs. So you get headlines that talk about, AI is going to take my job, robots going to take my job, but actually it's a little bit more complicated than that. So think, for example, if you've flown in a plane in the last 2 or 3 decades, essentially what you're doing is you're putting your life in the hands of a giant robot for 95% of that flight, and what you've got is humans and machines coexisting to do a better job than either would independently. However, headlines about robots taking jobs and AI taking jobs generally get the attention of a certain group of individuals in each country. Those individuals tend to live in iconic or work in iconic buildings. In New Zealand, that's the iconic building that most of them work in. So politicians working in short-term electoral cycles tend to get very concerned about how these technologies are moving fast and tend to have knee-jerk reactions. But the thing is that political cycles don't really work well with the speed and scale of some of these changes. And so you get things like Brexit or the rise of Trump happening as sort of knee-jerk responses where people want some sort of certainty around their future. But if you sort of peel back some of those layers around some of these responses and understand, why jobs are being lost, why globalization has moved centers of efficiency, you start to look at where the dissatisfaction is coming from. And a lot of it comes from neoliberal economic theory, which has really dominated, certainly in the US and in Europe, a little bit in New Zealand and Australia, the last few decades. And so effectively, that theory said that if you support business and government gets out of the way, then trickle-down wealth will lift everybody evenly. However, if you look at the numbers, and there's some really interesting numbers, particularly in the States, this is what you see. So there's an organization called RAND Corporation in California. They did a report a couple of years ago that looked at income inequality in the States. So if you have a look at the bottom lines here, they're interesting because everything below that yellow line is people who have normal incomes. And so what you're seeing there is from 1975 through to a couple of years ago, your income actually never changed much. So if you were 50th percentile income earner and in the mid-70s you earned about 28,000, then the adjusted income that you would earn now or even 2 or 3 years ago would go from 28,000 to maybe 30,000. So this is what you're seeing as the death of the American dream. Even if you look at that chart and you see the 95th percentile in yellow, the 99th in orange, nothing's really changing. Like even if you're at 99th percentile, things are starting to go backwards for you. It's only when you get to that top 1% that you start to see, where these sort of backlashes are coming from in the political system, and where you see social media start to amplify some of this extreme dissatisfaction. What's fascinating about this is if actually wage level increases had matched productivity increases, this graph would look completely different, and low income earners would actually be earning about twice as much as they did in the 70s. But this whole neoliberal economic idea that trickle-down wealth will lift the tide of everyone, that's completely failed. So there's a paradigm change coming down the line now. Technology affects jobs, impacts politics. Last driver of change across everything is climate change. So no matter where you look now, you are seeing every data point indicating that the climate is heading for a significant shock. Just in the last 3 or 4 weeks, the UK Met Office published data that said we're now down to a 50-50 chance of avoiding 1.5 degree rise in global temperatures by 2030. So that's a massive change in the data. To give some context, up until about 5 or 10 years ago, it was less than 30%, now we're up to 50-50 in the space of a very short time. So we're seeing accelerating change in climate, and that's going to have significant issues. So if you start to peel that down, for example, think about air travel. Increased extreme weather events mean increased turbulence, mean changes to flight schedules, mean increased operating costs for airlines. If you think about shipping through the same sort of lens around extreme weather, supply chain disruptions now will just be exacerbated by more extreme weather events in the future. So this is really quite a fundamental change that organisations need to start thinking about immediately. Now, what I'm going to take you through next is some insights around what's going on around the world from a global level. So when travel stopped, it meant none of myself or colleagues around the world could get on planes and share some of these insights like we used to do. So I set up a regular call every month since March 2020. I've talked to colleagues in Washington, Singapore, the Middle East, the UK, and Scandinavia. All of my colleagues have either advised presidents, prime ministers, or been on national security councils, or all three. And we regularly look at what we're seeing from our part of the world and triangulate it with what we're seeing in different parts of the world. And so I'll give you some insights around those conversations over the last 2 years. So, as I mentioned earlier, the pandemic is still one of the major shapers at the moment. For context, current thinking around the development of variants, one of the theories is that we'll just take a single person who's immune compromised on a cocktail of heavy sort of antiviral drugs. We'll take one of those people to have a reaction where the coronavirus mutates, and they become this sort of living laboratory from which other variants could flow. Now, at the moment, current estimates are around over half the world's population has been infected with Omicron. So we have billions of living viral laboratories in play. And there's also this mistaken assumption that because Delta wasn't as bad as Alpha and Omicron's not as bad as Delta, some people assume that the evolutionary path is for COVID to get less and less severe. That's not how virus evolution works. So it could be that the next variant coming out actually has a much higher fatality rate and a much higher transmission rate. But around the world, you're seeing people just abandoning masks, social distancing. You go on the tube in London, no one's wearing masks anymore, and governments have no social license for lockdown unless people are dropping dead like flies. So don't discount the pandemic yet. In the States, what we're seeing is increasing polarization. So this is a really interesting example of this. This was when there was a protest early in the pandemic where protesters without masks believed that lockdowns and mandates were sort of a violation of their human rights, and that they really wanted to believe social media hype that it was all just a massive hoax. And then what you saw was clinicians coming out on the street and actually fronting them and saying this is real. But you're seeing polarization in all sorts of areas across the States now, mainly fueled by social media and fake news and high levels of inequality. So people are really questioning about how the States is going to respond to some of this global maneuvering right now when domestic issues are potentially so distracting. Given what's going on around the world right now, and particularly in Russia, I think the world's largest cyber attack is overdue. I think that heavy infrastructure and critical infrastructure is ripe for targeting. And what you're seeing now is that motivated hacker groups or individuals have access to tools that previously only nation states had. That's because of breaches in NSA, for example, where quite advanced hacking tools have been released into the wild. So you're seeing massive levels of threat from places that you would never previously see it, because the sophistication of tools is now at the reach of anyone with a laptop. China is really leveraging global uncertainty like never before. However, with the Ukraine, what we're seeing is that they are learning a few lessons and potentially re-evaluating their plans for Taiwan. And we'll talk about that a bit later on. But really, the pandemic and the decline of the West over the last few years and the rise of Trump has given China the ability to accelerate its plans to become a global player. So keep watching China. Global institutions are really under pressure at the moment. And through the pandemic, you saw, for example, Trump abandon support for the WHO. But you're seeing this level of VUCA really meaning that some of those institutions that were set up post-World War II under Bretton Woods need to be potentially restructured or strengthened in a way to allow them to bring stability back into a world, because what we're seeing is that current systems of governance really aren't fit for high levels of volatility. So you're seeing democracy being eaten from within, and you're also seeing dictatorships and autocracies. They're very brittle. And typically rulers in those types of governments, they benefit from creating crises and then appearing to be the saviour of the crisis. But those systems are very brittle. So if you watch what's going on in Russia right now, it'll be interesting to see how that evolves in the next 6 months, because that's a very brittle style of leadership. Same in China, where you have strong men, and it usually is men at the top of those systems. They are not very flexible or adaptable. Democracy at the moment is not really fit for purpose, but there are other forms of democracy which are better suited to governing in this situation. I mentioned earlier that we've got these complex systems in play. That makes it extremely challenging to give accurate predictions of where things might go in the future. And for evidence of that, you can look at where some experts have made predictions, particularly around the pandemic. So in the first few weeks after lockdowns, you saw economists saying things like it's going to be a W-shaped recovery, a V-shaped recovery, an L-shaped recovery, but they were all completely wrong. It was actually a K-shaped recovery, where you had increase in inequality, where technology-driven firms profited extremely well, where wealthy people benefited, and those who were poor actually were manifestly worse off. But if you look back to news coverage at the time in March, April, May 2020, there wasn't a single economist quoted as saying it's going to be an uneven K-shaped recovery. In hindsight, they'll go back and go, oh, well, of course that's right, but that's complex systems. You can only decipher them in hindsight. We're also seeing, I think, the pendulum swinging from a generation who grew up thinking that war was something that happened in our parents' or grandparents' time. And this is where you saw some of these global institutions being eroded in their support, because we're in this new era of stability, right? Who's going to go to war now? It's a new piece of history. But I think we're seeing that pendulum swing back now, and you've seen that happen with moves in Europe just in the last 2 or 3 weeks. So if we start to go down that funnel and think about, what does this mean for New Zealand? I mentioned keeping an eye on China. The challenge with keeping an eye on China is it's very hard to understand. So this is a great quote from Ai Weiwei, who's a fabulous artist from China. He's also a dissident living outside China now. Had this very insightful quote where the opacity of the moves of the Communist Party means it is very difficult to look in from the outside with any degree of confidence around what they're actually planning to do. You just contrast this with what happened in the Trump presidency, where you had Trump tweeting sort of barely formed thoughts in crayon, essentially, like a shotgun every hour, whereas the CCP is very careful about the opacity and the message it is sending. On China, it's interesting to look back as well. So you go back to the 2000s and you see where the power bases were. So these were the countries that traded extensively with the US. And you can see the power base that creates. If you go forward, then you start to see quite a different picture. So China now has quite a significant role in world trade, and all this talk of decoupling becomes extremely problematic because of the complexity that entails. However, there's huge tension here in the Straits of Taiwan. The gap in the middle there is about 180 kilometres, and just south of there is the South China Sea, where just an enormous proportion of world trade goes through. And as the missile flies, that's only 2 or 3 minutes from the Straits of Taiwan directly into the South China Seas. So if there was military action in those straits, that would immediately disrupt much more of the supply chain and make the challenges that we have now look like a kid's picnic. That's problematic for New Zealand because we have concentration risk as a country. So these are our total exports growing significantly over the last 3 or 4 years. We also have a problem with trade surplus, imports versus exports, which is about 50%. This comes back to that interconnection of supply chains and raises issues around globalization. For context, our exports to Australia sit around 12% right now. So you start to get issues raised around what's happening with globalization. This is a guy who knows a couple of things about globalization called Larry Fink. BlackRock's CEO has a few $100 billion under management, but essentially he's calling the end of globalization. So this is quite a significant change in how you're seeing global trade. You're seeing also issues at the moment around global trade and also democracy. So if you look at the Economist annual survey, you're seeing countries ranked around levels of democratic governance. Interesting, you'll see the US is actually categorized as a flawed democracy there for a number of reasons. New Zealand is actually ranked second in the world behind Norway, but democracy is fairly fragile and dictatorships grow like weeds. So you've really got to look after really good systems of governance. There's so many global challenges rely on really good governance, and it's in decline around the world. Another insight as well for what's going on in New Zealand, I mentioned inequality wasn't as bad in New Zealand as it has been in places like the States. However, in the last 2 years, you've seen something extraordinary happen. So Bernard Hickey is an economic analyst, and he looked at the numbers that the government published, and you're seeing this enormous wealth transfer, right? This is from a Labor government as well, which I found is completely extraordinary, but really stuck still in that neoliberal economic theory, where essentially the economic stimulus supports meant that you exacerbated inequality rather than dealt with it. And that's going to create significant issues down the line for New Zealand. Once again, complex systems spinning in ways where people don't quite anticipate the outcomes. But this is really important for New Zealand. So what does that mean when you start to filter it down for leadership teams? Well, I'm doing a very large project right now for a big client where we're looking at geopolitical risk and what that means. So this is, we're now 4 weeks into it, 4 weeks more to go, looking at geopolitical risk scenarios. There's a very good reason why you should be concerned about geopolitical risk. So you're seeing leaders around the world starting to recognize this and wake up very, very quickly. So this is the CEO of Nestle Global saying that what happened in the Ukraine basically raised that on their leadership radar to the very top of their challenges. And what normally happens in organizations is you typically think about mapping issues against what's important and what's urgent. So what should you pay most attention to, what do you need to do now, what's the impact it's going to create. And most organizations have some form of this matrix going, whether informally or formally. But what's interesting is when you start to layer macro scale changes over this matrix, what you start to see is that some of these issues start to move around and they get reordered in ways that you should be thinking about now rather than waiting to be reactive. There's nothing like being proactive and having those discussions ahead of time to get yourself prepared. One of the other things you should start thinking about is how to understand complexity. So a friend of mine is Dave Snowden. He runs the Cynefin Institute in Wales. He has this really nice model called the Cynefin matrix for understanding complexity. It basically says you should try and think about whether you're operating in an area where you should leverage best practice, whether it's complicated or whether it's complex. So best practice would be a call center, for example, where you have a rote script. Something happens, you've got a flow chart, you can respond in a certain way. Complicated would be where, the Swiss watch repairer, for example, where you can pull something apart and reassemble it. So typically in a business world, that might be a legal expert, where you take an issue to them. They've got all that knowledge. It's not complex, just complicated. They can help you resolve it. When you get into complex situations like the outbreak of a pandemic, typically you want to avoid spiraling into the chaotic in the bottom left. You want to try and bring it back to complex as fast as possible so you have a quick series of responses. But in a VUCA world, you need to understand what the environment is before you start thinking about what mental models you start to apply to that environment. For leaders in New Zealand and Australia, you need to start thinking about how you would have a local or a regional response to supply chain disruptions. I mentioned earlier that we have massive concentration risk in China, and really New Zealand relies on China for trade and the US for security. That tightrope is going to be no longer walkable very shortly. The other thing leaders should start thinking about doing is balancing essentially what goes on in the engine room versus innovation. So if you give that some more context, exploitation is usually in that sort of simple response I mentioned earlier. We talk about complexity, stuff you know well, stuff that you do well, and clarity around next set of actions. Exploration, on the other hand, deals in uncertainty, complexity, typically innovation, and leaders need to think about how you balance those two. So organisations that stay exploring typically don't generate a lot of money very quickly and get lost. Organisations on the left-hand side that exploit business models, Nokia is a classic example of that. The challenge is, how do you do exploration in such a way that corporate antibodies don't kill that off before you can take it into the engine room? So coming back to what I mentioned earlier, is that you need to understand what's going on around the world at a macro scale level, not just in technology, but a range of different areas. You need to think about what this means for where you sit and where you play in your sector or your business, and what are the right questions that you should be asking before you start thinking about response. And so, speaking of questions,
I thought I'd start with a really topical one. What does the Russian invasion mean for the China-Taiwan tensions, do you think?
Yeah, so one of my colleagues in Europe writes books about China, like We Have Breakfast. I think he's written 16 books in the last 10 years. I had a long conversation with him about 3 weeks ago about this very topic. His response was that it's likely to have triggered a review of China's plans around Taiwan, because they have an untested army. They've seen that even though the prevailing thought in China is that the West is in decline, they've seen the West come together with sanctions and Finland and Sweden joining NATO, etc. So they'll be a lot warier now about how they think about that engagement. So Xi has typically said that reunification with Taiwan is one of his key goals. He's up for re-election at the Congress coming up later on the year in China. The CCP is fairly risk averse though, and so they'll be rethinking their plans. I also talked to colleagues in Washington about this. Up until January, Taiwan, China was probably the biggest foreign policy focus for the US, and there was real concern about war there. Now the current thinking is that it's more likely to be a hybrid war, where they might attack, GPS, for example, to cause navigation confusion. There'll be cyber attacks, there'll be trade issues, all these sorts of things, because a full-scale invasion is really quite dangerous now. They've seen what happened in the Ukraine. So I think it's forcing China to put that on the back books for a while, and they'll probably wait until the next US election to see who gets in and what their response is on a policy front. But it's unlikely the US foreign policy is going to change, which at the moment essentially is combat Russia, combat China, and build allies. So renewed focus on that.
So really that sort of, I guess the Ukraine came out of the blue, sort of really shifted some thinking.
Yeah, it's interesting that the so colleagues in Washington also said that many of the Nordic states were saying after Crimea, get out of Afghanistan, it's a distraction, leave it, and start thinking about Europe. But in Washington, the paradigm was, Europe's fine, nothing's going to happen. And there was all these weak signals that came through. So a couple of years ago, for example, Sweden increased conscription levels. I remember talking to a colleague at the time in Sweden saying, what's that about? And they sort of went, oh, well, we just sort of do these sort of things. But in hindsight, they could anticipate where things were going, and they were really worried, justifiably.
A question that a lot of people have sort of voted on here and asked is, you might have to have a wee think about this, but if you were to fast forward to 2050, what type of lessons will we have learned from the past 10 years? So sort of 2012 to 2022, where we've seen this, the Trump, the changes geopolitically in the US, some of these social media impacts.
Yeah, so it's really difficult to think in those sort of timescales now, simply because of the current levels of volatility. There are sort of two schools of thought. One is we could all be screwed, and the other is there will be the other is that there will be a degree of realistic optimism now, and realistic optimism is really important because you need to be able to think that there is a way ahead. It's going to be difficult and challenging, but unless you participate, you're part of the problem. So actually stepping up and saying, every little thing I do now can make a difference, particularly in climate change, is really important. Because to actually be effective against climate change, which is the single biggest issue facing the world right now, you can't just do it with carbon capture or with EVs or with renewables. You need everything. Change, right across the board. So what's fascinating to me about that is I talk to some leadership teams about this. I say, well, as soon as Air New Zealand let you carbon offset flights, I do it all the time. And I tell clients that. I was with a client, a very large organisation in Auckland a couple of weeks ago, and someone said to me, we've only started doing that last week. My response is, that's been available for 2 or 3 years. If you talk to Air New Zealand, the level of participation in that very simple opt-in is tiny, like low single-digit percentages. That's one thing you can do just to show your level of support and recognition of the scale of change. So I would like to think if you looked back from 2040, 2050, you could see whole thousands and thousands of different things that you can do, choices you can make every day to try and get you to a point where we actually have a livable planet.
Another top of mind thing is artificial intelligence, and a question here around your thoughts on the future of AI, because there's all sorts of commentary around it, from the doomsday to the impact. But what are your thoughts on the future of that?
So I'm just doing a very large project for a client on this at the moment as well. But first of all, I'd say that people vastly underestimate the speed at which this is changing. So a colleague of mine, he co-founded the world's largest and best AI firm. And it's really interesting comment a couple of years ago when I sat down with him when travel was a thing. I sat down with him in his office, and he pointed out the example that if you took a researcher today, and she was a leading researcher in AI, and she had a good model which could recognize, a glass, for example, or a cup. And you deployed some cloud services running that model to create high levels of accuracy and recognizing that, then it would take 4 or 5 hours for that model to get up above 90% accuracy. So you could get a whole range of different glasses or cups, put it in front of the camera, it would just go glass, 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 glass every single time. Right? He said, now, if you took the equivalent level of computing power and took it back to the late early 90s, you gave the researcher access to that equivalent computing power in the same algorithm, and then she ran that algorithm, it would take her 250,000 years to get the same level of accuracy. Right, so she might have just retire, go on holiday, and just hand it over to the next generation. So in a short space of time, things have moved extremely fast. But the important thing is not to confuse that with what's called artificial general intelligence, which is a machine that can effectively do what humans do, because we don't even understand how we operate. So actually replicating that is extremely difficult. what machines do really, really well is one of two things: running complex rule sets again and again and again perfectly, which is why planes can land on autopilot, or taking large data sets and looking for patterns. So one of the interesting things is an organization called OpenAI in San Francisco. Earlier this year, they released the second version of an image generation AI. And effectively what that can do is nothing short of magic. You can type in plain English a term into a box and it will create the image. So the famous example that's come out of that is you type in plain English, koala doing a slam dunk. And up comes a photorealistic image of a cute koala slam dunking a basketball. It's a totally made up image, but it looks perfect. And you think about all the things that would go into a person understanding that and a machine doing it is astonishing. So there are some areas where machines are going very, very fast. And the best examples, perhaps in medicine, where you get AI helping radiographers, for example. The best games of chess are now played with grandmasters and really powerful computers working side by side. So I think we're heading to a world where you see machines and people working alongside each other to scale up dealing with issues, because demographics is a major problem. So New Zealand has the lowest birth rate on record. Around the world, birth rates are going down. So you need to have machines in some cases picking up workloads.
Yeah. There's a bit of cynicism around governments and political cycles, but
surely not. Where's that coming from?
It's probably a New Zealand orientated question, but who in government, particularly our government, I would suggest, investigates these future trends? I mean, what's the mechanism? Some of the topics you're advising on or talking to, and what sort of, how does it feed into their thinking?
So I would say New Zealand is not alone in the world in having, and I'll put this politely, not a very coherent view on the future. Countries that do this well, very few and far between. Singapore, so I've dealt with the Foresight team, the PM's office in Singapore a lot. They do this very well, but it's taken them, almost 1.5 decades to get to that point. They're very purposeful about their intent. But interestingly, something's happened in New Zealand in the last year and a half, which may change that for this country. This really interesting development called long-term insights briefings. So a colleague and I kicked this off about 10 years ago, but it's taken 10 years for it to come into legislation, where all government agencies must submit to Parliament this long-term insights briefing around issues which are relevant to them. So it's really trying to institutionalise this idea that to navigate increasingly complex situations as a country, officials within government need to think coherently about the long term. So I'm optimistic that that's going to trigger a lot more considered thinking around the long-term direction for this country. The flip side of that is there is opportunity here because we're a small country of 5 million. We don't have a federal-state split. If you go to some countries that have that federal-state split, wow, it makes New Zealand's governance look efficient and organised.
Yeah. Look, I'm just conscious of time, but probably one to sort of pick up on is around global economic outlook. And I know you're not an economist, but you can't seem to get a sort of cohesive commentary. And a lot of certainly our exporting clients are, looking at that. I mean, certainly it's uncertain, and you've got this sort of tension between the whole world relies on China, and certainly New Zealand does. But what do you see in terms of the markers on there? Certainly volatility. I understand that. What are you picking up on around the sort of next sort of 3-4 years around economic?
Yes, I would say New Zealand exporters need to think about reducing concentration risk. Start thinking about markets which are still close to home in Asia. So that's Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, South Korea, Japan, India, places like that. Need to think about what might happen with rising food and energy prices. So what you're seeing in Sri Lanka right now, for example, is likely to happen in many other countries. So rising food prices and shortages of food coming out of the Ukraine crisis and energy prices mean that many developing countries who are already having issues before will get tipped over the edge. And so that creates more volatility, like a cycle that will just repeat. But for New Zealand exporters, I think having a serious look at diversifying away from China is really important, both for import and for export. It will be an interesting test to see what happens to Australia. So if you're looking for signals of how this is going to play out, Australia might be the canary in the geopolitical coal mine, because Australia has really planted a flag and said we'd look to the US for security. And they have done a few things to anger China. So China's stopped coal and wine and a few things from China, but still wants iron ore. Right. So if Australia really wanted to put a stake in the sand, they would say, actually, we're going to stop exporting iron ore, but it would shoot themselves in the foot. So there is potentially this development of what's called co-opetition. So they cooperate on one level, but compete on the other. But if China makes a move into Taiwan, then all bets are off as to what's going to happen. So you could see the US conceivably getting to a point where they say to Australia, you need to stop iron ore exports. If you want to lean on us for security, you really need to hurt China. So sanctions goes full on. And Russia isn't really a good example here, because Russia never was really involved in the global system. Really easy to push to one side. Russia's GDP is about the same as Australia. So nothing near the size of China, nothing near the level of globalization or involvement in those massive supply chains. China is a different beast altogether. So there's a couple of things there. I would start, if you're an exporter, wherever you rely on heavily on Chinese goods for final production, start looking at concentration risk, start thinking about options, start looking about alternate markets, and have a conversation around what do you do before you need to get to that point. Be proactive rather than reactive.
Actually, another question is picking up on China. I guess a lot of commentary around their interest and footprint into the South Pacific, which is obviously causing New Zealand concern, Australia concern. But how do you see China's footprint or influence playing out in the Pacific?
I think China is probably pretty opportunistic. They're expanding in ways that aren't hugely risky to them. One of the fascinating things here is that you see people getting really concerned about China expansion. And China really only has a couple of bases outside of China. One's in Djibouti, and they have presence now in the Solomons. The US has hundreds of bases around the world, and they spend 3 times as much on defence as China. US neighbours are Mexico and Canada. China neighbours include North Korea, India, Vietnam, Russia. So you would think they've got reason to increase defence spending. But China's really learning from the US playbook over the years. How do you get soft power? How do you increase investment? And the Solomons is a great example of that. Basically, everyone said, well, job done, China's contained, don't worry about Cold War anymore, don't worry about Pacific nations. And China just slowly built presence until you see, the Solomons agreement coming out, seemingly of nowhere, but it's just been building up through years of neglect from Western allies.
I guess, just to come into a little bit more into senior leadership teams and boards of directors, and this tension of there's a lot happening in the short term. Business as usual is getting harder. It's more expensive. It's more challenging. It's more energy. Just with the way things are. But how do companies get out of this reactionary mode? The view of looking for what's over the next horizon versus dealing with what's here. Because this is that challenge. It's a bit like your explore.
Yes.
In terms of, but it's a real challenge.
It is. So one of the insights from doing this work on pandemics in 2015 was we talked to a lot of large companies about supply chain resilience. We came to the conclusion that resilience is expensive in the short term, but cheap in the long term.
Right.
So it's an investment. And if you think about it in those terms, then you start to make investments. So what are some of the scenarios we're facing? What are some of the questions dropping out of this? How we respond if? A lot of this comes to having those difficult and challenging conversations. So scenarios will never accurately predict the future, but they will start some really difficult conversations at a leadership team level. So what if all of a sudden you couldn't export to China next month? What would you do?
Yeah.
Right. Those are the conversations you need to be having to start thinking about that. And if you can think about diversification earlier and proactively rather than later, you need to invest in that. Like I say, it's expensive in the long term, but expensive in the short term, cheap in the long term.
There's one question before, earlier in your presentation around there are other options for democracy. I was going to ask a question like what?
So interesting examples include things like representative democracy, where you take a small sample that represents the larger population, you bring them together for 3 to 5 days, you focus on contentious issues, and you bring in experts from both sides of the debate, and you get away from the social media-driven soundbite media environment, and you enable people to hear both sides of the discussion in a way that lends itself to civilised discussion. So there's an example of this, if you're interested, an experiment run a couple of years ago in 2019 called America in One Room, where New York Times and a philanthropy in the States did exactly that. So they flew in a few hundred people that represented most of the American population, put them in literally one room for a few days, had experts from both sides. And what they found was the polarisation of views on contentious issues came to a civilised middle point. In the States, particularly around abortion, gun control, these red button issues from politicians where they simply exploit sound bites and get really alarmist. But you find that when you bring people together for a civilised discussion, you generally land a middle ground, right, on a logical outcome. And so that form of democracy works really well in this environment because we've already seen in New Zealand what happened in the Wellington protests. That was just fueled by social media and by complete conspiracy nut jobs, really. And that is not going to go away in New Zealand.
Yeah.
It's a really dangerous thing. Inequality goes up, that stuff just takes off.
So I just think I'll probably finish this on one question, which I know is on just about every company and senior team's mind is around
Bitcoin.
No, not Bitcoin, but the talent war,
Yes.
And I think this is a new term for New Zealand, but, in many of the, other parts of the world, it's not that new, the
Yes.
war for really top talent. But, due to our borders shut and a whole variety of reasons, it's about every business is struggling
Yes.
to, how do you see that as a pattern that will continue as the borders open? There's a bit of a fear that, it's almost returned, well, not a fear, there's a feeling it'll return to how it was,
Yes.
and was that sustainable? But, for really top talent, will New Zealand be able to, and companies be able to attract that and compete on a global
Yes,
stage?
that's a very relevant issue. Typically what you tend to see is, in most issues, a reversion to the norm. So when situations stretch to either side of the norm, you'll find something sort of, eventually rebounds. At the moment, a lot of young New Zealanders are heading overseas for opportunity, and you see a proportion of them stay. But you're also seeing a lot of interest in people who saw how New Zealand dealt with the pandemic and who are interested in actually coming here because of that. But the challenge is, once people come here, then maybe the poster that attracted them in the first place doesn't quite stack up to reality. So we're not clean and green anymore. We have environmental degradation from agricultural practices. Cost of living is really high. Inflation is high in other parts of the world. House prices out of control. One of my clients, he's on a LT, very well-paying organisation, came out from the UK, went to buy a house in Auckland. He said, so he bought it year was, he bought it in October, couldn't move in until February. He said in November, the real estate agent rang him and said, "Have you moved in yet?" He said, "No, I haven't moved in." He said, "Why?" He said, I can resell your house for $300,000 more now." And he said, "That's just insane, right? How do you actually get people to settle in an environment where that stuff's going on?" And so there are a few fundamental issues that we need to address before we can think we punch above our weight there, because once you land, you get quite a different picture when reality hits. And house prices here are just completely unsustainable for attracting talent.
Hey, look, I'll sort of draw it to a close there. We're right on sort of almost 10:15, so we sort of stick to our time. There's been some feedback on here. It's been a very insightful session, and thank you very much. And I echo those words. It's a difficult topic. I know you do it professionally, but the topics that we've covered today are certainly more top of mind now than they ever have been for New Zealand boards and companies, especially those exporting, but also those relying on the imported people and tourism, etc. So I really want to thank you for that. I really value our relationship and the ability that we can just get together here in Christchurch and do this.
Yeah, that's great. I love it.
And it's fantastic to be able to engage, with clients across, the broad range of companies that we're working with. So thank you for your time, and thank you for those that have joined us this morning.
And thank you for some great questions too. Excellent.